Your ears do not deceive you. You have just entered the Cryptid Creator Corner, brought to you by your friends at Comic Book Yeti. So without further ado, let's get on to the interview.
Hello and welcome to Comic Book Yeti's Cryptid Creator Corner. I am one of your hosts, Jimmy Gasparo, and I've had a run of really great luck recently with these episodes because I have returning guests, and I love returning guests because it means that they had a decent enough time the first time to actually come back and talk to me again. And this is an individual that I have had on the podcast before. I've met him in person at Baltimore Comic-Con, and we are here talking again about the most recent Zoop campaign as we record this. I think it was just launched today for Slay and the Girlfriend Survives. I got to read the Slay, and it is like a monster hunting Western. Absolutely loved it. Can't wait to talk more about it. Please welcome to the podcast, Jeremy Whitley. Jeremy, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
No, I really appreciate it. I'm a big fan of your work. I've told you that before, which is one of the really nice things about this podcast. And going to Baltimore Comic Con as press and getting to talk to people and say like whether not just some of the earlier work that you've done, but both of my daughters, they're 13 and 8, but throughout the years we've read a ton of My Little Pony comics, and I know your name has been on quite a few of them that we've read. And not only do they love them, I love them too. they're they're really great. They're fantastic comics. Um, and
Yeah,
so
those are the things I love. 'Cause, I have two kids as well, so like having shows and comics and stuff that we can enjoy together. That's always like aspirational for me, because I've got to put up with the stuff I don't like as well. Uh, and I think interestingly, that's sort of how I got hooked up with My Little Pony. I had a kid who was really into Dora the Explorer at that age, and if you've watched 2 episodes of Dora the Explorer, you've seen every episode of Dora the Explorer, and, they'll hit you with the same songs over and over. So, like, My Little Pony popped up, and I was like, "Hey, this is actually, like, funny. Like, this show is good and enjoyable, and I'm having a good time." And then, I just happened to sort of stumble into knowing people that were working on the book, and, they asked me, "Do you know anything about this?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I've seen all the episodes." So, it's
yeah,
nice.
that's great when that can work out. But I'm also I was a huge fan of Navigating with You. I thought it was one of the best graphic novels that I've read in recent years, and
Thank
I've
you.
told so many people about it, whether or not adults or young people. Just what a wonderful story it is, and I just thought it was incredible. Um, but yeah, now we're going to talk about Slay and the Girlfriend Survives, which is definitely a departure from My
Oh,
Little Pony.
sure.
Um, but I just really, I mean, I know because of your podcast, I know your interest in horror. But I thought Slay, I mean, I love a good Western. I love a monster hunting story. I really loved how this one kind of played out. And yes, I'm just kind of curious. Can you tell listeners what are Slay and the Girlfriend Survives about, and how long have you kind of been working on, these two comics?
Yeah, both of them are sort of, I think, interesting, these genre mashups. They have, uh, the sort of things that I think are earmarks of a lot of my stuff, and that they, include, stories of sort of queer characters, have strong female leads and stuff, and in particular, um, I think deal a lot with tropes that we see a lot in genre fiction that I like to sort of take and turn on their head. Um, and for me, with Slay started as this sort of combination of things I wanted to do. That, like, I love fantasy stuff, and I love sort of the feel of westerns. Um, Even though, like, sometimes the particular points of reference in time and imperialism that mark westerns are not always my thing, but like that feeling of being on the frontier and not knowing what's around the next corner, and the feeling that there could be monsters out there. Um, and this is, a case where that is literally true, because we're dealing with a post-apocalypse where, like, uh, we've lost all sort of telecommunication, all sort of, um, internet and phone and everything, and there are these sort of magical monsters roaming the world that you could just run into at any time. And we're following in this story Layla, who is a 19-year-old girl who has just sort of discovered that her mom, who died when she was young, was a monster hunter, and she wants to be a monster hunter like her mom was. Um, and so she's sort of like gone out looking for the Scarred Rider, who is this legendary monster hunter. Um, and in trying to find her, has found that she needs money, she needs food to get by, so she's pretending to be her to get a job slaying a monster, and immediately finds herself in over her head out here on the edge of civilization where there's nobody to help her out. Um, and finds herself between this monster and the person she's pretending to be, both of which are, I think, probably equally dangerous, if Ryder is not more dangerous, maybe.
I really liked in the story how I wasn't sure, because I tend to be a fast reader, and I've said this on the podcast before, and I usually have to go back and read things 2 or 3 times to make sure that I'm paying attention to the art just because 'cause I'm, such a fast reader, for on Slay, Alex Smith, I believe, you worked with as the artist, and the art is great, especially the monster and, fight scenes, but I couldn't really tell, like, when or where we were. And I love that not being kind of like, writ large in terms of exposition. Like I really enjoy stories that like trust the reader to kind of use the context clues to figure out like what is going on here, like where are we set, like what has happened. And it also I think that kind of uh added to the I the appeal of westerns for me where, I just remember watching my grandfather loved westerns, and every, like, weekend, if he was home and he wasn't at the track betting, he was watching a western, and, like, I had no idea where they were, and it was always it's like, trying to figure out, like, what border town they were in where this western took place, but I really liked that kind of aspect of it that you just kind of let the story, play out. Um, I really enjoyed that about it.
Yeah, I really wanted to sort of give that feeling of, um, I mean, there's a lot of fun westerns out there, but I particularly love the Sergio Leone stuff, the stuff that also takes a lot of influence from Kurosawa's films. Like I really love Jimbo, and I really love Sanjuro, and sort of that feeling of being um again sort of on the frontier, on the edge of civilization,
Yeah.
where anything could happen when you're out of eyesight of everybody else. So um that was sort of the feeling I wanted to get of it. And I think the post-apocalyptic stuff that works best for me is stuff where they're not where it's far enough from whatever's happened that people aren't just standing around going, it used to be different. Like, you know, there's this horrible thing that happened, but like, they're carrying on with their lives and dealing with um, these new their new horrible realities, such as they are.
Yeah.
Um, and that's sort of the feeling I wanted to get of like, yeah, this is not an everyday thing, but a fairly normal thing for there to be monsters out here on the edge of town that are, taking people and disappearing people.
Yeah, humans have an amazing ability to rationalize almost anything, like, over a certain period of time, and so, like, when you get past the point of everything is falling apart to it has fallen apart and we've now settled into our new normal, like, I agree, I sometimes find that to be more, you know, interesting storytelling in terms of where do we go from here, and I like how Layla's just kind of dropped, right in the middle of it, and her story kinda gets played out. Um, but yeah, the actual fight scene and all the work that Alex put into it, I thought was fantastic.
Oh yeah, I love how all that came together. Alex is is great, and Kelly, who did the color on this, I think it really works in that it's not sort of oversaturated. There's not too much. You get sort of, they're fighting in the snow and in the dark, so you're getting a lot of like, trees, the white of the snow and the red of the blood, and like, it gives a cool mixture of it feeling like, um, really outside of any particular space and time, but like, you really get to concentrate on this fight and on these, you know, Layla is very much on the back foot from the moment this fight starts and doesn't really know, uh, has really overestimated how much she's capable of fighting this thing.
Yeah. And I really and once, I really love the character of the scarred rider, as well. And I feel like that's especially in westerns. When I think of like I mentioned, my grandfather watching westerns, like those traditional westerns that were so huge in the 50s and 60s. Like you don't see a female character like that in
Yeah.
any of those movies, like at all. Um, and I really love that about the Scarred Rider. I really loved, just the dialogue between her and Layla, 'cause it is she's very n Scarred Rider's, like, comes across very no nonsense, but, her dialogue is biting as well to to Layla, and I really enjoyed that. I thought that was really well done. Like, it's one of those things that there's just enough there that I'm like, "Man, I can't wait to see how the rest of this plays out."
Yeah, I really wanna give Ryder this feeling of, like, uh, she's often on her own. She doesn't talk to people a lot, and when she does, she just doesn't have time for bullshit. Like, um,
Yeah.
she's, from the moment she, meets Layla, she's like, "Yeah, you were stupid. Like, this whole thing was stupid.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're doing. You're in way over your head. Here, hold this head. I gotta take this somewhere." Like, you know, um, whereas I think Layla is very much, our audience is line into it, right? Of like, she's had somewhat of a cushy life as much as you can in the post-apocalypse. She's had people looking out for her, and she has decided she's gonna be a big hero, but she is in no way prepared for what that means.
Right. So other than, uh, Kurosawa films and some of those westerns and the Sergio Leone westerns that kind of have, take some of that influence as well. Where do you think in terms of your horror influences, the monster hunting, that idea of, somebody traveling town to town to take on the town's monsters, where do you find your horror influences lie when you wanna kind of, draw from those and put into a comic?
Um, I've always loved monster movies, and I love a good vampire or werewolf movie. I love I love especially when you get this is I feel like very narrow uh group of monster movies where it's just like it's it's less special effects and more sort of just this physical brutality that you can really feel like how strong these monsters are, how dangerous they are. There's uh so few movies that sort of, I guess, really get that across. Um I think like for for all its many issues, I think the, Guillermo del Toro Frankenstein has like really gives you this feeling of how big and strong and scary this monster can be. Um, I I like when monster stories aren't afraid to make a monster who is too strong. Um, I love a good Castlevania, right? Where like some of those, whether it's the animated version or the games, just where like these things are smart and they're strong and they should be too much for you, and you have to like really figure out how to deal with them. Um, on the fly and while it's difficult. Um, so I think, that for me is I want to have things that feel too big, and I love the sort of intersection of fantasy and horror that monster movies often hit where, like, you know, when you're watching a fantasy movie and the dragon is just too, like, it's too easily taken care of, or it's uh so this fun thing fighting a dragon, whereas, like, I feel like if that were in the real world, like, a dragon would not just be a monster that you'd have to fight, but it's basically a natural disaster at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That will not that would not be a fun thing, to do by any stretch of the imagination. Um, with your podcast, with Progressively Horrified, where you and your co-host, Ben Kahn, I think, who is one. Ben's been on the podcast before as well, uh, and
And Emily Martin, who's
Emily
my
Martin.
yeah,
Yeah.
my
Eh,
co-creator on Princeless. So
with with your podcast and talking about horror movies, looking at whether through a progressive lens or some of the issues that you talk about, like feminism in horror, LGBTQ issues in horror. I'm just curious, like what has been the most surprising thing that you've kind of learned about horror and how fans approach horror, through the discussions in your podcast?
yeah, I think I think what's surprising to a lot of people is, um people tend to think of horror as a very, like, thin subgenre of things that are largely like slasher films. And, I think certainly in the 80s and early 90s there were a lot of those, enough that it sort of became its own subgenre. But I think once you get outside of slasher films, there have always been queer people and queer, metaphors for being queer, and uh for dealing with all of that sort of stuff in film. I mean, going back to James Whale, like, going back to Frankenstein, there have always been queer people in film, and have always been queer people in horror. Um, Again, I guess, to keep the Frankenstein going, all the way back to, you know, several of the people who are sort of the founders of horror are sort of notably queer, even if they couldn't really do anything or talk about it at the time. Both Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker um, are people that people have researched heavily over time, and I think has been shown to be, uh, both of them were very openly queer, at least within their communities. Um, and those people are, the founders of this stuff, and queer folks have always been there, and uh there's always been these metaphors under the monsters of, like, who we are, and what it means to us as queer folks, as people who sometimes view ourselves as monsters, and not just in stories but in, day-to-day life.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Like I think a lot of times it gets glossed over that the folks who were on the ground floor of some of these stories that have lasted literally over 100 or more years.
Yeah.
Even if they couldn't openly identify that way, you're right. There's been a ton of research about. I mean, I'm pretty sure Mary Shelley and the group of folks she was hanging out with weren't really looked upon too kindly by various sections of polite society.
Yeah, without a question.
um, well, so let's turn and talk about the other half of this flip book, The Girlfriend Survives, which especially fans of superhero comic books, I'm sure are familiar with the term, fridging, coined from Kyle Rayner's girlfriend, who ended up in the fridge. Uh, and so it sounds like you're running like headlong right into that trope and just flipping it on its head. Am I
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, well before, Gail Simone coined the term "women in refrigerators,"
Yeah.
it was very much a thing that happened where, female characters in the story of male characters, where the male characters were the main characters, and especially in superhero stuff. Um, those characters couldn't be vulnerable. You couldn't hurt them. They had to be able to take anything. So the real way that like villains would always get at them is through the people in their lives, and especially through those female characters who were their wives, girlfriends, aunts, sisters, whatever. Um, but specifically girlfriends. And the case of Kyle Rayner is a I think a well documented and sort of insane version of that, where they he for anybody who doesn't know where the term comes from, he comes home and finds that his girlfriend has literally been dismembered and stuck in the refrigerator by one of his. Let's be honest, Kyle Rayner has a lot of very forgettable villains. And people remember the girlfriend being stuck in the refrigerator, and there are a lot less people remember like who did it or what that story was,
Yeah.
um, because that was sort of just this very extreme moment of something that had been going on a lot, and continues to go on, is sort of spread out more to movies and TV. I feel like, and comics has become, I think, very conscious of it. Um, and in a lot of cases, the result has been that there are fewer of those characters rather than that those characters are written better, which is probably the better solution, to have well-rounded female characters, and to have them have their own goals and stories and things like that. Um, so The Girlfriend Survives was, I think, started off as a very sort of obvious take on this phenomenon, and sort of recentering it around this girlfriend character who is in the situation of having uh, become the girlfriend of the secret identity of this superhero, that she doesn't really know anything about his other life or anything like that. And so has been sort of unknowingly put in the sights of this, maniacal arch nemesis of his. And in the first comic, is sort of knows is sort of coming face to face with dealing with a supervillain who should be well out of her league, but uh, she has some secrets of her own up her sleeve, and I think by the end of this issue, people will have a little bit better idea of what that means, and sort of where we're going with it, because I think it's a lot of fun. It is it's going to be a mini series. I think we have 5 issues of it scripted out. Um,
Oh wow.
and yeah, it's sort of, I think, plays very much with a thing I like to do, and have been doing since working on Princeless, which was like, when you're working in a genre that has a lot of tropes, like getting to that trope and just making a hard left turn when you're there. Just, what would be the decision that somebody normally makes at this point in the comic? All right, we're going the other direction. We want to, see what happens when we mix it up, and give this character agency, and make this story about her rather than, her being the victim of this story.
So in terms of tone, I mean, it sounds like this is part superhero story, but one of the things I think you do well in playing with those tropes, and making that hard left turn is, you know, playing playing up the comedic elements of these tropes. Like, the is that part of this as well? Like, are you leaning into the comedy of this type of situation?
Oh, absolutely. I think it is something where we lean into some of the comedy. I think there's certainly some mystery to it. We wanted it to be sort of twisty and fun to follow, because I do think it's fun to sort of hang a lampshade on this stuff. But then if you don't have anything to follow that up with, anything interesting to do, then it's a good first issue, but you need to have the rest of a story. Um, if you're gonna really go out of your way to do that. Otherwise, you might as well write an 8-page story in an anthology somewhere. You'd be much sharper that way. Um, but yeah, I think it is uh, it is funny. I think, and it is. Uh, I hope it's going to be a fun read for people. It's certainly fun to write, and think about the ways that we can keep keep twisting this and keep turning it just a little bit to keep people guessing and to tell a version of the story that hasn't been told when there's been a lot. Well, I guess when the same sort of version of the story has been told a lot of times.
Yeah. And this one's illustrated by Luke Nakashoji.
Yes. Yep.
Oh, that's awesome.
And they're really great. They've got a lot of they've done a lot of webcomics work, and it has been colored by my buddy Jamie Noguchi, who's also my illustrator on School for Extraterrestrial Girls, and both of those guys are really wonderful. And if you haven't seen the cover for this first one, I particularly love this one because we have our main character Delilah standing on top of a pile of broken refrigerators. The sort of homage to this, Punisher kills the Marvel Universe style cover where there's a pile of, heroes and villains beneath him, but it's, a pile of destroyed
Yeah.
refrigerators she's standing on.
I will say for any listeners who were yelling at their device that plays the podcast that Jeremy and I both know it was Major Force that killed Kyle Rayner's girlfriend. Like we
Yes.
didn't want to show anybody up, but we know who it was. So don't be, we are those types of nerds. Does it surprise you that, like, I mean, Gail Simone, you mentioned, like, she coined that women in refrigerators, like talking about that trope of, killing the male lead's love interest or girlfriend or family member, whatever it was, to, you know, kind of show the character's growth. And like, that's the only purpose really for the female character. I mean, she coined that. I had just looked it up to make sure I was right, but in 1999, like, does it surprise you though, after that initial conversation about it, that it still seems so like prevalent for so many years that it
Yeah, there are cases I think where, stories get to that point, and it's not that you can never kill a female character. It's that if I think personally, if the most interesting thing you can do to a character is kill them, then they're not a very good character. Um, and it's not as if they can never die, but there needs to be, I think, more to it than that. But I distinctly remember watching the beginning of Deadpool 2 in 2018 and them like the inciting incident being them killing off his girlfriend. And, then he's got to go on a quest for vengeance from there. And I was like, how many years it'd been almost 20 years at that point since Gail had been
yeah.
coined that phrase that had become a popularly known trope. And they were just doing it in such a like straightforward, uninteresting, dumb way that I was just like, I'm do people really not even know this well enough to call themselves out doing it at this point? Like, that they can see they're doing it, that there wasn't somebody in the process of making this movie that was like, hey, actually, this is bad. Um, and, uh, it still happens, unfortunately. And, sometimes it's to prove a point, and sometimes it's just because they can't think of anything better to do. But like, I think it's one of those things that, um, we talk about the Bechdel test being another one of these things that like not everything has to pass the Bechdel test, but you have to be able to explain why it doesn't if it doesn't, right? Like if it's just a story about two guys, of course it's not going to pass the Bechdel test. But
Right.
like, it should be a thing you think about at some point while you're making it. So, if you kill off this, closest thing to a female lead that your series has had so far, like why? What does it do? What do you accomplish?
Yeah. No, I agree. Um, my when I first started playing D&D in 2017, and we sat around before we started and we all read like our backstories, and I think three of the five of us, like our character's formative backstory was that their like family had been killed, and I'm like, we're all just terrible storytellers. We got to get better at this, guys.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, like, uh isn't it a much rougher like origin story if like if your wife was the murderer, right? If she's gone off on a rampage somewhere, or she's been corrupted, or um, had her own story that has caused her to get to this point, rather than that just being like her being sacrificed for male pain.
Yeah. Well, my second character does have a family. I learned my lesson the first time. Also, I thought it was, the only reason my first character got to go adventuring was because his whole family was dead, right? So I think
Yeah,
it's much more interesting now with my second character. He has to figure out how to go on an adventure and still manage his home life. I basically have now created my real life into my D&D life, and so that's another problem for another therapy session that I have to figure out how to deal with, but nobody's
yeah.
fridge in this second version.
I think it's interesting to me, sort of like the time I was breaking into comics, and what was going on in comparison to this as well, because I think my first Marvel story, which is a short story called Misty and Danny Forever, which is a um, story about a version of Danny Rand and Misty Knight, who are married and have a kid, and uh, are trying to figure out like how to mix that and being superheroes. Um, and it was very much a reaction to that being a time in comics where they just kept breaking up relationships because people at the top insisted that like you couldn't tell an interesting story with a married character. Um,
Right.
I think that shows an extreme lack of imagination, but also like I think is indicative of maybe people's personal lives and how they feel about either their personal life in a marriage, or their personal life not being married, and what they can and can't do. But I think if there there's an infinite number of interesting stories you can tell within a marriage and within a relationship, and I think I'm glad that I feel like we're finally opening that back up, because I think that was at the time the answer to a lot of people for that. The question of women in refrigerators is like, well, if we can't just kill them off, then we have to break up the relationships because we can't tell interesting stories with married characters.
Yeah, but I agree. You can. I think, and I mean, we can still tell there's plenty of stories being told about, single superheroes, vigilantes, but yeah, you know, I maybe it's just because I'm older now and married, but I do think they are interesting, interesting stories, and that trying to be a superhero and what that means, and have a family. And there's been some creators that have done it very well in recent years, who have told those kinds of stories and made it really interesting, and made it exciting and thought provoking. So, yeah,
Absolutely.
I agree with that. With the Girlfriend Survives and the comedy of it, I'm always interested in creators, like, what are your comedic influences, whether they've ended up, in the comic or not. But what is the stuff that really, makes you laugh?
I think I think especially when I'm writing a story that is comical and follows women sort of closely in this. I think a lot about both my colleagues who are in comics, people like Gail Simone and Kelly Sudaconic and Kelly Thompson, who have told sort of the stories, a lot of them with comedy in there, that sort of uh, allow their female characters to be human in ways that are embarrassing and funny, and um, in a lot of cases, like I I feel like I feel like, as a guy who grew up in a small town with a lot of other very aggro guys, that like if I had been exposed to more stories, I think about women by women, that sort of allowed me to know that girls are also gross and weird and horny, and dealing with all the same shit that was going on in my head. I feel like
Yeah.
you can be much better adjusted that way. I feel like, uh especially in the South, I think there's a desire and tendency to want to, uh, I don't know, both oppress women and put them on a pedestal at the same time, so that like, they can't have those same sort of like feelings and issues. Um, but I love like a bridesmaids or stories like that that have like uh girls making the same sort of stupid mistakes and having the same sort of stupid issues that the guys do, and just allowing them to be human, because I think there's a lot of comedy in being human, and I think comics sometimes in particular is scared of comedy. Even though like our some of our favorite guys like Spider-Man, like so much of what makes people love him comes from the sort of comedy of him just being an absolute fucking doofus.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's a tendency to go with the superhero side of comics, especially, and we've seen it like definitely in like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but take the quips and like the quippiness and the one-liners, to almost to an extreme. But that definitely I believe started with the comic books. But there's so many other elements uh in terms of comedy, so many different things you can do. And although I think it can be tougher, and I've said this before, on the podcast, it can be tougher with a comic because there's a lot of comedy that has to do with timing, and it can be tough, but it can definitely be, it can be done, and it doesn't all have to just be, you know, quippy one-liners to lean into the humor of certain things. And yeah, there's certainly a ton of comedy to be mined from being a human. Being
Oh yeah.
being human is like is wonderful and terrible and gross and
Yeah. And I think like, there we've lived through, I think, a really interesting time in comics where people like Matt Fraction and Chip Zdarsky, were working on things that like just showed how funny you can be in a comic book, how much comedy you can pack in there. And Kieran Gillen, his jokes are generally much more I feel like highbrow, and they're borne out over the course of a lot of story, and sometimes they're still just a stupid pun, but like they're folks who are really good at writing comedy into stories that isn't always just sort of one liners. um and I absolutely think there's a place for one liners, but I think if anything, like I think the success of things like uh the James Gunn Suicide Squad and the James Gunn Guardians of the Galaxy, I think show that people are very willing to invest in these what should be B-level characters, when they just feel human. They feel um like like people you could talk to and hang out with, even if they would be just the absolute worst in some cases, like Star-Lord. Um, but you get invested in those guys when like they feel real.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Um, I do like with the Girlfriend Survives that you continued the comic book tradition of making your characters' names alliterative. I think that's very important. It's one
I'm
of
a
one of
sucker
my
for it.
favorite things.
I
Yeah.
I am a
I
sucker for an alliterative comic book name. Um, in fact, I don't I don't know if remember this, but there's a bit in Navigating with You where like Nisha is jealous at one point because Gabrielle has an alliterative like comic book name. She's like, "Ah, you sound like a superhero, Gabriella Graciana." Like that,
yeah.
that sounds like a superhero name.
No, that's a great bit, and yeah, I love that too. So as soon as I was reading when I was reading like the press release, and I'm like, oh, Delilah Dillon, yeah, great, perfect. No notes. Love that about it. In terms of crowdfunding stuff, was there anything in particular for your decision to use Zoop as a platform?
Uh, yeah, I've worked on crowdfunding before. I've had only one that I've ever run a long time ago, and the everything that comes after the funding is just an absolute nightmare for me. Because like I got into writing comics because I love writing comics. I love doing that part of it. I love working with the illustrator. When it comes to like printing and cost management and distribution and all of that, it's just a nightmare for me. And Zoop had an option where they'll take care of all that stuff for you. It's a slightly higher percentage of the overall cost of the thing that they take, but that's so much more appealing to me and allows me to do the thing that I love doing without having to pick up so much more of the gig, because that is, if anything else, that's why I don't self-publish stuff anymore. Why I do my best to, work with publishers, is because um, all of that other stuff is so much work that at a certain point you find yourself like spent a whole week of working on comics and you haven't written a single word. And that's always a moment. That's always a moment in working on comics, regardless of why it is, if it's editing or doing interviews or whatever. When I get to like the end of the week and I'm like, I haven't written a single page, it's always like a depressing moment for me. And this, really gave us the option of like, this is a funding platform that's specifically for comics. It's not everything like, the big one has become
Yeah.
a funding for just about anything. Um, they know what they're doing. They know comics people, and they know how to like print and distribute this stuff at a reasonable price. And those are the big things. I want people to feel like they're getting their money's worth out of the campaign, and I want to feel like I don't hate making comics.
No, that's fair. All very fair. Yeah, well, I'll have a link in the show notes so listeners, you can just go to the show notes, you can click on it, it'll take you to the Zoop campaign, so you can back Slay and The Girlfriend Survives. I'll have links also, you can follow Jeremy on social media, and so you'll know whatever he has coming out after this, other stuff he's working on. Um, but yeah, I really love Slay. I'm very excited to back and check out The Girlfriend Survives, and the campaign. As we record this, the campaign will be live for about 30 days. So I'm going to try and get this out the second week in February. So if you're listening to this like right when the episode comes out, you'll have about 3 weeks. You can check out back the campaign. And I mean, I think Slay is great. I love indie comics. I love this type of stuff. I love, the idea of a flip book, 2 different comics, 2 different genres. I think that you don't see a lot of stuff like that. And, as I've told listeners before, like if you like this stuff, if you want to see more of it, then you gotta back it. You gotta let folks know that um that it's the type of stuff you want. It's the only way we're going to, unfortunately, um, until we come up with a better system than capitalism, the only way we're going to let people know what it is we like is if we buy it. And Jeremy has my full trust and confidence. He has just made some amazing comics over the years. And a plug for Navigating with You, if you haven't checked it out yet, you absolutely should. Even don't let the maverick of it all, like the young adult, scare you away. If you're like somebody I'm not a young adult person, it is a phenomenal um, story. And the artwork is tremendous as well. Yeah.
Thank you so
So
much.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's important to me. I always want people to like enjoy it and get a chance to to check out something new and to feel like, I mean, with this in particular, with the flip book, I wanted to make sure it was something that like people are only getting here, because obviously these are both stories we're gonna continue, but this is a one of a kind with this flip book where we wanted people to have a new stories, but also a good value where uh wherever we pick these up later on, they're going to be separate stories, but here's this chance to sort of both support and sample both here.
yep. Yeah. And so folks will be able to do that. But yeah, Jeremy, I also wanted to thank you for taking a look at Penny and the Yeti and the kind words that you said about it. It means a lot to me. I reached out to a few people whose work really kind of inspired me and made me want to start to not just talk about comics, but to also write them. And I really appreciate that. It means the world to me. So I
Well,
wanted to
yeah.
thank you.
Well, thanks. I mean, I meant every word I said about it. It's a lovely little book, and I think it's something that a lot of people will enjoy, and I think a lot of kids can take something really good away from.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But yeah, Slay and The Girlfriend Survives. They're going to be on Zoop. A horror story, a horror western in one, and then a kind of a superhero drama meta comedy. So, I mean, what more could you want? It's comics, folks, and we love them. But yeah, thank you, Jeremy, so much for being on the podcast. Shout out to my brother Bobby, Cryptid Creator Corner's #1 most dedicated fan. Bobby listens to all my episodes. Thanks for listening, Bob. Um, Listeners, rate, review us, do all those things they tell you to do about podcasts. It really does help. You can find me on Blue Sky, and I'm sometimes on TikTok talking about comics or posting videos of my dog. So if that's your kind of thing, you can follow me there. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Jeremy for coming on the podcast and chatting with me again. I'll see you next time. Good night.